Our guest today is one of the most recognized voices in the field. He's chaired the Learning Technologies Conference in London. He's run the annual L&D Global Sentiment Survey since 2014, and he's the author of Learning Technologies in the Workplace. Alongside Igle Vinescate, and please do correct me if I'm butchering that pronunciation, Don, he has just published a new report on the role that L&D teams play in a post-AI world called the Transformation Triangle. Donald Taylor, thank you so much for doing this. Before we get into the report itself, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that went into it? So how long did it take? How many people did you talk to? And what sort of data were you working with?
A very good question, Harry. And when we're talking about research, it's the right question to ask at the beginning. Too often we jump in, assuming there's a solid background, and I think we should always ask the question. For the latest report, the fifth in the series, we spoke to about 20 organisations, and they had employees ranging from 500 to 130,000 people. But we also draw on the previous 4 surveys that we've done, surveys and reports and interviews that we've done, and that's a really much larger set of case studies and people and employees in the range up to 400,000. And I think also importantly, a really wide range of sectors. So it's not just people who are dealing with knowledge work, but people working in retail, hotels, a whole distribution, a whole bunch of different sectors. And that's important because it's very easy to get caught up when we're talking about AI with the area where it's probably most obviously having an impact immediately.
Brilliant, brilliant. I know a lot of work goes into these reports. So the report itself is called the Transformation Triangle.
Yes.
For anyone who is listening to our conversation who maybe hasn't had the chance to read it yet, could you take us through it, the kind of broad overview of what it's actually about and why you and Igle felt you needed to write it?
On the name, by the way, I have worked with Igle for probably, well, certainly since the first report, which is 2.5 years ago. I still don't get it right, but it's Igle Vinescate is as close as I can get. And I was in Lithuania a couple of weeks ago, and they were sort of giving me something like a 6 out of 10 on my pronunciation. So I think that's okay, but I'm working to improve it.
Yeah.
Now, I want to get through the transformation triangle as quickly as possible to set the basis for it, but it's very easy to misinterpret what I'm saying. So for anybody listening, please just take this as being a TLDR, an overview very quickly, and then later in the podcast, we'll get into in more detail. So the reason for producing this idea of the transformation triangle was to give people a sense of hope. It sounds a bit sort of strange, but there's so much talk that particularly the learning and development field has been going through, and so much noise since ChatGPT was launched, which was only November 2022, and that's only 3.5 years ago, but it seems like it's dominated conversation since then. And it has, but it's also left us unsure about what's happening next. And one of the things from the Global Sentiment Survey that's become very apparent in the past 2 years is a growing sense of uncertainty, a growing sense that people don't really know what we do next with L&D. But they do feel a sense that what we're doing at the moment isn't sustainable. And I think they're right. So the Transformation Triangle is the result of conversations that Igle and I have had with a large number of organizations looking at who's doing things well. So it's not some sort of speculative idea which we dreamt up, and it's trying to be what we say is descriptive rather than prescriptive. So we're trying to say not you should do this, not prescribing what people do, but rather descriptive. This is what people who are using AI effectively are doing. And it's a triangle because there are 3 possible variants in the future that we see. Now, I love the idea of the transformation triangle, but who knows? It could be in the future, it'll be a square, a pentagon, or something else. There may be other futures, right? Yeah. But at the moment, we're looking at these 3 futures, and they represent ways in which people think differently about learning in an organization. It's not just they're using AI, it's a different, what we call organizing logic. And that's the thing to hold on to. There are 2 key things to hold on to. One is there's a different organizing logic for L&D, and the other is that as a result of that, learning becomes consequential is the word we use. It becomes something which is important for the individual and for the organization. At each of these 3 points, so the 3 points are not that we should worry about it too much before we get into the detail, but the 3 points are skills authority, enablement partner, and adaptation engine. And each of those has a different organizing logic, but the common thing between them is, in each of them, learning is consequential. It's important for the individual, it's important for the organization. So that's my 3-minute overview of what we're doing here.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And I think effectively that triangle gives L&D people a structure to work in a post-AI world where content has become so commonplace that you can easily, quickly generate this content. So it's like, what do we do next as a profession? And it gives us a clear focus for that.
Harry, that's the issue. I don't want, you're completely right, that's the issue, but I don't want to say this means that content is dead. Not at all. We still will be producing stuff. But AI enables the production of content to be both disintermediated and commoditized, which is a fancy way of saying anybody can do it and it's going to be everywhere. So you doesn't need L&D to do it, and it's going to be super abundant. And in that space, that's not something that gives you a USP. It's not unique that L&D produces the content. So what do we do instead? Bear in mind, right, I started as a stand-up trainer in the 90s. So my job was, this is before the World Wide Web, my job was you create something, you give it to a room, either in a book or in a class, because that's the way people learn. That's still the model that everybody in L&D and outside L&D thinks about learning, but it's a model that doesn't apply to a world of AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so before we go any further, Don, I think it's probably a good idea to break down the triangle itself and those 3 different areas. So we've got the skills authority, enablement partner, and the adaptation engine. Can you dig in a little bit more on those 3 points?
Bear in mind that I could probably talk about this for at least now, and Egler herself can run an entire workshop for a day on this. So
Yeah.
I'm going to try and boil it down to 3 minutes. Skills authority, the organizing logic here is that skills are a critical business asset. That's what we're thinking about when we think about the skills authority, the idea that skills are not something which exist as a sort of adjunct to getting the job done. They are how the job gets done. And when skills are regarded as a critical business asset, then the skills authority is a core part of making the business work effectively. So we have to identify what skills we've got, what skills we need in the future, and be excellent learning scientists at knowing how to get from here to there as L&D. But in addition, the organization lives and breathes skills as its way of ensuring that people can do their job. And that's the difference between what I call the Instagram or the performative view of skills, which is, oh, we've got this framework, oh, we're doing these things, and the reality of a skills authority, which is, this is how the organization works. We live and breathe skills because we know that's how we do our job. And if you think about, at the moment, it's largely knowledge working organizations, consultancies, and so on that will do this. But in the future, I believe increasingly organizations will come to see that in a world where content is super abundant, understanding what your people can do is where we can make the difference in effectiveness.
So can I just dig into that a little bit more? Because one of the conversations that we've had with some of our clients with regards to skills is absolutely skills are the most important thing. But then the follow-on question for that is skills at an organizational level is not the same as skills at an individual level. So where does the skills piece lie with the individual job descriptions? And if the individual roles are changing as a reaction to AI in the market, are you saying that, you know, we're talking about, let's say, digital skills or future skills as opposed to foundational or functional skills? Or are we wrapping the whole thing up and just saying, look, skills needs to be a focus?
Skills is the focus. And in an organization where L&D takes the role of being a skills authority, skills is the focus. And which particular set of skills you choose will be the ones that are most important to the organization. So it might be future skills or foundational skills for a particular organization, but it might be technical skills for a completely different organization. So that's something which depends on the context. And actually, you raise a good point, Juliette, which is that context is crucial here. And too often we see in events like the conferences that I organize that people try to take something that worked in retail and superimpose it on manufacturing, and that just won't work. The context is crucial. In terms of the detail of it as well, you know, what matters is that people are taking the skills and what people can do seriously. Are they necessarily using a vast framework and platform? Possibly not. It may simply be that everyone understands, and there's a common language. That's very important. There's a common language of skills that is held in some way, and that people are assessed against those skills, perhaps not formally, but perhaps slightly informally, but they are assessed, and it is consequential. So if you're a major consultancy, at the end of a project, there'll be a wash-up, and people will typically be asked, did you develop your skills during this project? If so, how do you think you progressed? That may be a formal process, it may be an informal process, but it is captured in some way. The definitions are standardized or understood in some way. And most importantly, again, it is consequential. The people take it really seriously. It's not some sort of performance review where you do it in 5 minutes before you knock off at the end of the day. That's that skills authority. So that's the top of our triangle. Bottom left-hand corner is enablement partner. Skills looks at the skills. Enablement partner looks at what exists in the organization as a whole that is worth sharing. And the enablement partner role for L&D is where L&D recognizes that for whatever reason, we're not the people that should be a bottleneck. There is great stuff out there that people already know, and if we could surface it and share it rapidly, the organization will benefit. And here, I always think of Lou Platt, who was the CEO at Hewlett-Packard, and when he was an engineer, he wasn't a learning guy, but when he was the CEO, he said, if only Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knows, it would be 3 times more productive. And he was distilling in the 1980s this idea that there is this knowledge and skills that lie out there which if we distribute more rapidly, every organization can benefit from. Now, I think in a lot of organizations, that idea of there being a secret source that makes your company different and more effective, but is unevenly distributed, is really common. And here with Enablement Partner, what we're seeing is that that's recognized. Importantly, the culture of the organization allows that to be recognized, and L&D sets up the mechanism whereby it can be surfaced and shared, probably using technology, so that you're in Sydney, you're in a hotel reception desk, you work out a way of shaving 2 minutes off the check-in time of a guest. Great. You capture that in some way, surface it, and you share it across the organization. So now all of the hotel chain from Buenos Aires to Berlin can use the same approach. Again, the focus here is on the performance of the organization, the performance of the individual, and the idea that what's important is not that gets surfaced and shared, but that people learn from it and it's consequential. So people want to be going out there, picking this stuff up and applying it, and that seems being important in the organization. Of the points, third point is adaptation engine. So the adaptation engine is where learning and development kind of ceases to exist as a function in itself, but becomes part of a multidisciplinary team. We're going out and we're looking for where are the issues in the organization where performance isn't what it should be. Why? Could be talent, could be training, could be something else entirely. We go in and we find the reason for it and deal with it. The heart of this is the idea that performance is not a matter of necessarily what you know or what you can do, the skills and knowledge, but much more about the structure of the organization you're in, the tools, incentives, and so on, and working with that as a whole with a multidisciplinary team to sort it out. Going out and fixing things tactically, but also strategically looking across the organization and finding areas where performance could be improved. And that's your triangle, boiled down as quickly as I could possibly do it.
Very nice. Great job, Dom. Great job.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of organizations will hear those 3 points, or a lot of L&D people will hear 3 points, and they will be asking themselves, okay, we've got these 3 different areas where we might be able to focus. How do we actually figure out where we point ourselves, what direction of travel we move in? And is that a real choice for them, or is the research that you're seeing showing that they're already being kind of pulled along in a certain direction, almost subconsciously?
Well, it's certainly true that it's easier probably to go to one of these points than the other. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, I wouldn't say, but almost certainly in most organizations, there'll be what we call a gravitational pull to one of these points, just because of the way the organization is set up. But also it's important to say that what you bring to the choice of destination is important too. And I think that we typically say if you're thinking about where should I go, there are 3 questions to ask. One is, what's the most important performance problem that L&D could own? Because if you solve that, you're proving yourself. And this is one of the key issues, which is that one of the barriers to change, one of what we call the drags, if you think about something moving towards somewhere, there could be a drag pulling it back.
Yeah.
One of the drags is a cultural drag that means people will constantly think of L&D as the providers of courses. To change that mentality is crucial to help you move towards one of these new approaches to L&D. And the key question for them to ask to resolve that is, what's the most important performance problem that we could tackle? So we're not talking here about what can people learn. We're saying, look at the organization. Where's there a performance need? How do we tackle that? If we go out and try and tackle that, that doesn't get you straight away to a point, but it starts shifting people's perception of what L&D can do. And I've seen it time and time again that you tackle a problem, people think about L&D in a different way. They start knocking the door, asking you to solve problems, not to provide learning. A second question you could ask is, well, which of these 3 points will be best supported by the organization? Kind of your point, Harry, that there'll be a natural pull towards one of these points. Perhaps that's the right thing to do. It might be that you don't want to go there because you know the organization will benefit from going somewhere else. But that's a conversation you then need to have explicitly with your organization, because if they want to go towards A rather than B, you might find it better to go where they want to go first. And we've had organizations say, well, look, we knew that skills were important, but we realized that we couldn't start with a skills-based approach because we didn't have the infrastructure, and most importantly, didn't have the culture for all the managers to start taking skills seriously. So we started moving in a different direction first. And the third question to ask yourself is, what do I bring as an L&D leader to this? Because the experience that the leader of the L&D team brings will mean that some routes necessarily are faster than other routes because you've got the experience, the know-how, you know which questions to ask and what barriers are likely to crop up on the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonder if we can dig into that a little bit more. The report said something that surprised me a little bit. I think it suggests that most L&D teams will gravitate naturally towards a skills authority. Skills authority point of the triangle first because it's more of a natural cultural fit for them. It's more in line with what they typically do or have been doing up until now, day to day. And it's kind of a good fit for their identity. But despite that, most organizations can't effectively pull it off. So I wonder why that gap.
I wouldn't say necessarily, perhaps that we didn't put that over right in the report, but I'm not saying most organizations can't pull it off.
Yeah.
But it may not necessarily be the right point to aim for.
Sure.
So the thing about learning is there's a natural link between learning and skills. And there's been so much talk about skills since, well, at least the last 5 years, that people naturally will say, oh, yes, skills authority will go there. It might be the right approach. But as I was saying earlier, there's a difference between a performative approach to skills and making skills authority your operating, your organizational logic. The thing that you say, that's why we do what we do. You could do a lot of activity around skills. You could impose performance reviews that make people have to do certain things, to check boxes on a skills framework, all of which can be very useful. But that's an activity. That's not the same as making it your organizing logic. If your organizing logic has to be, we are stitching this into the fabric of the organization so that managers, executives, and everybody lives and breathes skills as being their way to know if we're doing our job right. That's a much bigger job that goes beyond the traditional remit of L&D. Now, the reason why that sometimes it's difficult to do that is that our role in L&D, we can absolutely get people to fill out things on a form. We can get them to self-assess a framework, and that's great. It's very valuable. But there's a huge step to go from there to making it part of the lifeblood of the organization, which is this business of making it taken seriously by everybody. And that means changing managers' behavior in particular. And if you want to change managers' behavior, they've got to be on board with it. And if they're not on board with it, by the time you walk out the office, they're already going back to what they already did. So that has to be a change management process. And I think the issue we're trying to highlight in the report here is that doing more skill stuff only gets you a certain percentage of the journey towards being a skills authority. Because like everything else on this triangle, it's a change management program, and that requires the involvement of people outside L&D. And then I think there's a common theme throughout the report. It is that all of these 3 points involve L&D getting out the office, building relationships, and understanding how the business operates, and working with people to improve that.
So can I just clarify, what I think I've understood. So when we talk about skills and where the focus or the vision for skills comes, it sounds like this is a really strategic decision that the overall organization would be making. So maybe a worked example might be entrepreneurial mindset, or, innovation and efficiency, or that type of thing. So in that way, there is a certain direction in terms of this is a strategy the organization wants to take, and then L&D can lean into that to be specific how that affects, line managers, their department, their role, and individuals' workflow.
Harry, I think you should do the rest of the interview with Juliette. She's clearly got it all down and she's understands what needs to be done here. Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. This is only going to work if the whole organization is involved. And if you're changing how people are doing things, then that change needs to be led from the top. Now, you can make certain steps yourself. And one of the things we do say in the report is that it might be that your organization isn't ready to change to any of these 3 points. If it is, though, Juliette, you're right, it needs to come from the top. There needs to be that momentum. We use throughout the report this analogy of a rocket journey. And if you've ever seen those clips of the Saturn V's taking off in the Apollo program, these are huge, huge machines that burn about 20% of their fuel in the first 100 yards, just getting off the launch pad, and they're incredibly slow. And that's a change management program, a huge amount of effort at the beginning, and you have to keep going. You just have to keep going on, and eventually you clear the tower, and then your speed picks up. And then you've got to keep going until you get to escape velocity, and then eventually you're able to start choosing your destination. But that effort at the beginning needs to be considerable, needs to be sustained, and you're right, Juliette, it needs to come from the top, or it needs at least to be supported wholeheartedly from the top. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I think it says somewhere in the report that oftentimes transformation isn't so much a mindset problem. You can't just by sheer force of will drive this transformation. It's often a systems problem. So you need that strong rocket ship if you like to achieve liftoff.
We beat ourselves up quite a lot in L&D, saying, well, we need to change our mindset. Well, yeah, possibly we do, and I'm not on board with that, but that's not enough. It's not enough to have positive thinking. There's a whole bunch of structural stuff that needs to change as well, and that means you've got to get other people on board.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so slight change of direction. The report obviously talks a lot about L&D in a post-AI world and what the new role of L&D professional should be. Kind of taking the assumption that content's always going to be a part of the L&D people's day-to-day, but it's going to be less of a focus. It's going to be more just something that's...
It's how we get the job done, yeah.
How we get the job done. But I was wondering if there are any other ways that you could see AI supporting L&D people outside of content in perhaps achieving transformation in some of the 3 points of the triangle.
Sure. So I think if you're thinking about the skills authority bit, then clearly there are huge things you can do with AI tools too. And I think we have to be a bit careful about AI tools automatically understanding what skills people have got. I think you have to have people involved in that operation. Otherwise, you run the risk of people feeling that they are just being labeled and packaged as part of a machine. And that's a great way to really make people unhappy and make them feel that they don't want to stick around. But having said that, I think skills intelligence engines mapping capability is an important part of that. Also, of course, they can surface gaps and they can find things across these huge data sets about people's skills in organizations that are simply impossible to find in a human way. With the Enablement Partner, I think it's really important that you can have tools where you've got an ecosystem where people can, and we've seen this happen for decades, people can create stuff and share it, but I think if you've got AI involved with this, it enables people to create their own content. And that's only one way of doing this, but let's say they're doing that, to create their own content and share that much more quickly. If you're asking somebody on that hotel desk to go off and create something which is not pedagogically superb, but good enough, that's going to take time and it's not their job. If they can use an AI tool to create something which is good enough, let's say, I don't know, using a verbal command, create a video which can be created by AI in 10 seconds to be double-checked and then circulated. Perfect. So that business of reducing friction in the process of sharing knowledge. Perfect. Excuse me. For the adaptation engine, this is the most obvious one. AI can look right the way across the organization and make correlations between things which are simply too complex, across systems which are too complex for us to really get a full view across. So they can look at workflow design, they look at performance, they look at what teams are doing, capability in as much as we've assessed it, and see where, join the dots and see where there are things that can be improved in a way that almost certainly at the moment for people, it's just not possible to do that because it's too big a picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, sorry, AI, it is going to support these 3 points of the triangle, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Really important to just bear in mind this point here. It's not just that content doesn't become the defensible bastion for L&D. It's no longer, so we can't rely on content as being our USP anymore. But it's also the case that everything I've just described doesn't have to be done by L&D. So whether you are sharing information, whether you're finding out about skills, whether you're joining the dots to look at performance problems across the organization, other people can do that in the organization, and they will do. So consider, do you want to be part of that or not? If you're not part of it, you're going to be taking orders from somebody else in the organization who's going to be doing that in a year or 2 years' time. There's a challenge there.
About the role of learning pedagogy, though. So I would say that if you are somebody who's passionate about developing people and you are in a L&D role, one of the things that you do know more than a subject matter expert is the idea of how people put learning into action, right? So the idea of getting further up Bloom's taxonomies. As you so rightly said, anyone can produce a 5-minute video, right? Mm-hmm. And as soon as that content has been consumed, it will pretty much be forgotten. But is there a stronger role for the expertise that L&D can bring in actually showing subject matter experts how? I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And I think this is definitely part of the skills authority piece, in the sense that we want to make sure that if you are a skills authority, you know very well how people learn and you set things up in a way that they can learn well using your pedagogical expertise. But it's also true with the Enablement Partner, definitely. With the Enablement Partner, L&D is not a bottleneck, but it is enabling people to do a good job, not necessarily a perfect job, but a better than average job. And they're doing that not by checking every last thing that comes through the door. Maybe that's part of the process at some point, but absolutely by setting systems up so that when people produce things, they produce things well enough. Now, there are going to be, and there are already, tools which enable you, when you're creating something, to go through a pedagogical process where you say, well, hang on, you've jumped straight in with this. You need to do this and that first. And by the way, at the end, how are you going to check understanding? For a very simple example. That should absolutely be part of the process that we're talking about here, rather than just giving people tools to create videos and saying, go ahead and fill your boots, do what you like, because that's okay at the beginning. Very soon, and we've seen this happen, very soon you create an awful lot of dross, which then prevents people going and trying to use this system for finding anything out because they lose faith in it. So yes, you're right. The pedagogical approach has two advantages. Has an advantage tactically that you've got to produce good stuff, but also has the advantage that it maintains faith in the system.
I think that potentially links to another idea in the report that would be good to pick up on, which is the idea that if we want to achieve transformation in any of these 3 areas, we need to make sure that the learning experiences that we deliver are still consequential and meaningful. So I wonder if we could dig into that a little bit more, Don. What does that actually mean, and why is it so important to whether these transformation processes actually work?
It's kind of a consequence of a proper transformation, which is that you've succeeded if people are taking learning seriously, not because it's something abstract. And look, I'm a great believer in learning for its own sake. I love learning things myself, but for 95% of people at work, learning is a route to an end. And making that learning consequential is, as I say, the result of a system where performance based on people learning is taken seriously. And it's important because it shifts our understanding about what we need to do. So we talk about this mythical seat at the table. Great, okay. But I honestly don't care about having a seat at the table. I do care about having influence. So L&D might not have a representation of the executive, doesn't matter. Does it have influence so that everybody in that room is saying, yeah, look, hang on, how are people learning how to do this new thing? That's much more important than having L&D having some board seat. Learning being consequential means it's personally rational. It needs to be rational for the managers so they make sure there's time for it, but it needs to be rational individually as well. So that people are demanding it because they know it matters for their career. And as we've talked about this, that then creates this learning, this working context where, of course, you're motivated to learn. You don't have to go out and use bells and whistles or some sort of silly game to get people to do something. We don't have to persuade, you don't have to mandate. People are learning because they know it's what they need for them. And that's this point where people recognize the value of it for themselves is kind of the point which we call activations. One of the factors that go into us saying, right, we are now activated. We're now out of the gravitational pull of our takeoff planet, and we're on our way to our destination because people are taking it seriously.
And one of the things that you said that I think is really interesting is this idea that we, L&D have been trying to get a seat at the table for quite a long time. As you say, the mythical seat at the table. One of the things that I think is interesting, the role of AI, but also xAPI can help, is looking more deeper at the impact of the learning and how that impact moves into goals of the organization. And I think it does seem to me that the time is right for AI and xAPI to work together to really become the knowledge engine of what are my people doing, how are they thinking about things, when they learn, are they applying it, and are they, what is the impact? Can we actually get to a point where we are getting to Fitzpatrick 4? I think the answer with these combined technologies is yes, we can.
I think you're right that it's almost like XPI came out a little bit too early. It created this huge lake of data. Right, and what do I do with that? Well, now, if you've got AI and you can go and query the data and you can correlate it with things, you've got a great route to saying, well, we did this, and look, you can see it had an effect down there. It's correlated with an effect down there. And yes, I think that's a great point which we haven't made in the report, but it's worth bearing in mind. xAPI gives you the route to a data set that does that link back to learning. I think it's also important for L&D to recognize that being busy is one thing, and goodness knows, anybody who's worked in L&D, listen to this podcast, I know you are busy. The problem is being the right sort of busy, right? We need to be not just busy, but we need to be depended on for providing the stuff that makes the business work. And that's, again, coming back to this point about learning being consequential. If learning is consequential, then we are doing the right sort of busyness. Otherwise, we could do a lot of work which people can look at and say, no, I don't think we're getting value for that. We'll cut that department off. Sorry, I sound very negative. I think there's a strong future for L&D. I'm just trying to make it clear there are some choices that have to be made. Let's put it that way.
But we're talking of the future, Don. So I believe you've been in the industry now for multiple decades.
You're being very polite, Harry. Thank you.
So you've seen multiple waves of change. Let's call them, like the advent of digital learning, mobile learning, MOOCs, etc. A quality to this new AI wave that you think makes it different, which really necessitates this triangle, or are we kidding ourselves again?
No, look, it's a great question, Harry. And I've stood on stage at Learning Technologies introducing keynote speakers for a long time, and I've attended lots of other events. And every year you have people standing on stage saying, things are changing, things are different. Then next year somebody says, no, things are changing this way.
Yeah.
But this time, really, folks, they are changing. And that's why I do make a play about having been in this field since the 80s and having started working on computers which had less power than your watch, even though they were huge and the size of a fridge freezer. I've seen things come and go, and I've explicitly followed trends and watched them rise and fall. And AI, yes, there's an awful lot of hype about it. And a lot of that hype is self-serving. But underneath it all, what you're looking at with AI is a combination of cheap memory, powerful processing, huge amounts of data, where it came from. A lot of it has been pinched off the internet, but there it is, huge amounts of data. Smart algorithms and global connectivity. And all of these things working together provide something which is qualitatively different from anything we've seen before. And we don't even know what to do with it yet. The tool is much further, even if we stopped today with any advances, it would be still far more advanced than anything we've had, and we'd be working out what to do with it in 10 years' time. The affordances of new technologies are emergent, which is a fancy way of saying we work it out as we go along, and there will be lots of errors on the way. So we'll find out, oh, we tried that thing, it didn't work, but that new thing over there, that does work. You start off just doing the old thing louder. Then you start doing old things in a new way. Then finally, at some point, you're doing new things in a new way. We're still just doing things louder. We're still just using AI largely to create more content. We are just at the beginning of a journey that's going to take decades to work out what's happening. And to come back to your question, it is genuinely transformational. And by the way, I have nothing to sell here. I'm not trying to sell you AI or anything like that. This is just my assessment as somebody who cares deeply about our industry and wants us to be ready for the future.
Can I just ask a question? When we talk about large data sets, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but one of the things that, you hear from learners is, I've just taken this course, whatever it might be, and it's great for the organization, but it's not great for me personally. And one of the things on large data sets is, you look at somewhere like the UK where we have, Ofqual, we have a regulated, system of education where there is no reason why with the utilization of, an AI platform, these large data sets can't be ingested, and then the learning, whatever that learning is, if it's leadership, if it's time management, if it's health and safety, that they can be accredited or at least recognized outside the organization, to avoid that problem of people saying, well, I get training from my company, but I mean, it's not transformable. I can't take those skills and show somebody else them. Have you had any experience with these large data sets? Have you got any, opinions on, how in the UK we might use data sets that, in a way that AI has never been able to do before?
And look, this is a brilliant question. It touches on so many things, particularly to do with the qualifications regime in the UK, which, look, there are issues with qualification regimes everywhere. They're an imperfect proxy for people's skills. And then you bundle in with that the funding that goes against that, and suddenly things get very complicated. We could have a separate podcast which is just about this and looking at the UK as one example against the world as a whole and all the funding regimes and all the qualifications regimes we've got. But to boil it down, no, I haven't got any experience of doing this. I don't think anybody's doing it yet. I think the key blocker, though, is not to do with any state or government planning here. It's more rather to do with, if you wanted a company to do some training for an organization that is recognized elsewhere, there's no incentive for an organization to do that unless it's a recruitment tool. So the reason why you have people come to your organization saying, oh, I'll go there and I'll get trained up on XYZ, used to be like 20 years ago, I'll be a Microsoft systems engineer. If I go there, they'll train me up, was because that was the currency of the industry they were in. For most organizations to train people up, they recognize there's a payoff. I can train people up, that's a recruitment tool, but they become more valuable and they'll leave. For most organizations, they'd much rather have a system whereby they train people up in something that is not transferable elsewhere. And I think EY did something very brave in producing their MBA, which they produced internally, which enabled people to get trained up. And it was recognized, and it was, because it came from AY, a sufficiently credible badge they could take it elsewhere. But I think they could do that because they were a large organization where it was a recruitment tool, and the effect of generating great learning and positive reaction internally was sufficient to mitigate the downside of people then taking what they had and going elsewhere.
Thank you for that.
I think the key thing about data sets for me is that eventually, and it won't take very long, we're entering the area of what people are calling hyper-personalisation. But I think even that is a misnomer. I think hyper-personalisation suggests that our job is to create content that's personalised. I think we're moving quite rapidly towards a place in the future where people aren't thinking about content so much as just how I interact with my work. And yeah, naturally, I'm getting stuff from my machines, could be computer, phone, whatever. that is helping me do my job better, we would call that hyper-personalised content based on the context of work and the data set that is surrounding somebody in their particular workplace. The person just says, that's what I do when I go to work. They don't even see it as being learning.
So last question, Don. If someone reads the transformation triangle today and walks away with one thing, what would you want that to be?
Hope. In
Brilliant.
one word, hope. I want them to feel, yes, change and the future is in our grasp. We can do stuff. But I'd also say that with hope comes the need for courage. We can't keep doing things the same way we've always done it. Look at the future, see there's a map, make your own way there. Bear in mind that you'll get support from everybody else, but ultimately it comes down to you having the courage to make the change.
I think that's a brilliant place to end. Thank you, Donald. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
It's been great to be here, Harry. Juliette, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.